So I think we're on chapter 6 tonight. At least that's what I'm hoping we're on, because that's what my notes, what I've been working on all day is chapter 6. And you guys know that I like to do my references, and I don't think there's anything new up here. We did include the Strong's Concordance. We're going to talk about a little bit of some word meaning, but nothing too drastic here. The commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Jesus is talking, but he's building on the Old Testament. And so oftentimes I think we think that the Old Testament, Jesus came to change the Old Testament, but no. And so we're gonna spend a little bit of time looking at where he is and what he's talking about. This evangelical dictionary of biblical theology, I love these. We have a tendency to speak in Christian terms, and if you're new to Christ, you may not know what the definitions of the words are. And so the Evangelical Dictionary of Biblical Theology, and then there's an Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, and both of those are really good books to have in your library as you're going through God's Word, especially if you're dealing with mature Christians who will speak to you in terms of Ecclesiastes and they'll use words that you might not even know yet. So I looked up Sabbath in there. The Sabbath concept still continues to elude me in several ways, and so I just wanted to figure out what it was that we were talking about as Jesus was doing some things on the Sabbath. And then the rest of these, I think, are our usual go-to commentaries that we look at. So let's get started. Picking up in verse 1 of Luke chapter 6. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" Now the disciples were plucking heads of grain, and this reflects the regulation for gleaning, oddly enough. We're not just talking about violating the rules of Sabbath, but we're talking about gleaning too. We find in Leviticus, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. And so in Israel, you couldn't harvest all the way up to the edge. You had to leave some for the poor, but not just for the poor. Some of that was for the people who were traveling. If you just happened to be traveling through the area, you were able to draw on that resource. Fast food, right? This was the fast food of Jesus' day. So we're not talking about theft, and we're not talking about violating gleaning. And so what we're talking about is the complex set of Sabbath regulations that grows out of the basic commandment to rest. And we find that in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. And I put all of these in here just because, again, like I said in the section on my references, the Sabbath is rather complex and getting into its meaning. And so I just want to go over these so you've got some exposure to them. So in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And we find that again in Deuteronomy. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So it's a sign between God and his covenant partner. The Sabbath became one of the distinctive markers of Israel. How did you know a Jewish person? Because they kept the Sabbath. It was probably a lot easier than asking them if they were circumcised. Then prove it, right? Let's just wait till the seventh day and then we'll know. And the Old Testament takes the Sabbath observance so seriously that profaning it results in the death penalty. And so here we have some of Jesus' disciples. They're plucking some grain from that part of the field that they're allowed to do that. And the Pharisees are saying, hey, what gives? We read in Ezekiel, moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. And so this is a significant thing. This is at the very identity of who the Jews are. And to sanctify is to be set apart. And so this Sabbath observance sets the Jews apart from everybody else around them. So much so that there are instances in which their enemies waited to the Sabbath to attack. And one last note on the Sabbath, because I love what Slane writes. Just as joy is more than the absence of sorrow, the Sabbath is more than a cessation of labor. Resting in a bed all day does not amount to keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath is to be a delight and a joy. In fact, we read in Isaiah, if you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob, your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And so they're not called just to observe the Sabbath, but they're called to take delight in the Sabbath on that day. And so as we go through these quote-unquote Sabbath violations, I would ask you to keep in mind, ask yourselves as you're reading through this, are the Pharisees talking about the delight of the Sabbath? I don't think so. In most cases, they're not saying, aha, you are not taking delight in the Sabbath. What they're talking about are some very strict regulations that they are commanding their people to follow. And so picking up in verse 3, Jesus answered them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So you guys all remember that story, right? We find it in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has charged me with a matter and said to me, let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here. And the priest answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest, truly women have been kept from us, as always when I go on expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. And so what we're talking about now is we're talking about a different application of the law. Nobody else was supposed to eat that bread except for the priests. And yet David shows up with his men and they are hungry. And he tells the priest, give me some bread. And the priest does. It was day old bread, so it was okay. But we're talking about ceremonial restrictions of law. And when do they give way to human need? This is King David, the united rule just before the split of Israel. And so this is after the Exodus. This is after Saul, the first king. And so the Jewish discussions overriding the Sabbath. When are we allowed to override these ceremonial rules? The point is that David had the authority to act as he did, and that Jesus has the same right, but in a higher degree. Another point builds on the Jewish interpretation of this very passage. In verse 4 of Luke, Jesus himself stated that only the priests could eat the bread of the presence. This clause, though absent in 1 Samuel, David doesn't mention that in 1 Samuel, but it would have been understood by the Jewish hearer. Only the priests were allowed to eat the bread when it was changed on the Sabbath day. And so there's a connection here. If Luke was aware of this connection, then Jesus may be using the Pharisaic traditions to argue against their own interpretation of the law. And we're going to see that as we move forward. What Jesus is doing is he's clarifying their understanding of their relationship with God. And so Jesus makes a statement after this in which it's the second time that he uses the phrase Son of Man. We already saw it in the last chapter. And some have argued that Son of Man simply means man. But that's not the case here, because Jesus is declaring that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And to the Jewish mind, only God is Lord of the Sabbath. And so we pick up in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he, Jesus, entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man who was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. They're looking for that gotcha moment. Aha! He's violating the rules. So he's already declared that he is God in the Jewish mind by declaring himself the Lord of the Sabbath. And yet they still think that they can trap him. And it's coming from the scribes and the Pharisees. These are the people who get to make the rules, who get to interpret the rules. What constitutes work on a Sabbath? Can you just rub the grain in your hand? Or do you have to take it to a miller? What constitutes work? And so there's a whole bunch of regulations that are spelled out for this. And they were watching him. They were waiting for him to make a mistake on the Sabbath day. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or destroy life?" Jesus sensed the challenge, and he meets it head on. Luke doesn't tell us how he knew. And it's interesting because from my perspective, it could be a miraculous knowing. The Spirit could be whispering in his ear, "Hey, watch out for these ones." But it's also entirely possible that Jesus could just interpret body language. Right? Now, I see where you guys are coming at. Right? When I was a police officer, I began by telling the judge, "Oh no, that guy was angry." And so I was threatened. And the judge would ask, "Well, how did you know he was angry?" And at first I was like, "I don't know. It's just like a sense that you have." It doesn't. And so you would have to explain why you knew. And so you would say things like, "Well, his fists were clenched," which most of us would say, yeah, when somebody comes at you with a clenched fist, they're already angry. But only a police officer has to be able to articulate that in front of a judge, because by the time you get to a judge, I promise you they're not angry anymore. In fact, they're trying really hard not to look as angry as they did on that day. Right? And so good detectives are really good at understanding body language and trapping not just what that person says, but also using what that person is saying with their body language. And so it's entirely possible in my mind that Jesus knew their thoughts because he just happened to be better than your average detective, which oddly enough is still miraculous because we're talking about a carpenter. But Luke doesn't describe any of that. He just says that Jesus knew. Jesus he knew what their thoughts were. Jesus summons the man with the useless hand to come and stand with him, evidently in a prominently place where there would be no doubt about what was happening. Jesus is teaching a lesson here. Which is, if we're going to make disciples, by teaching them what Jesus taught them. So we got to pay attention. Jesus is beginning to teach a lesson here. Then he addressed the opposition, challenging them with a question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? What's interesting is there's no neutral position here. You can't ride the fence on this one. Jesus will recognize no alternative to the doing of good except the doing of evil. The refusal to save a life is tantamount to taking of it. And the man before him was leading an impaired life. To do nothing on the Sabbath would have been to destroy life. And Jesus came to save. Now, if we are supposed to be rejoicing on the Sabbath, right? If we are supposed to be, I know one man who will spend the rest of his life rejoicing on the Sabbath, right? And he will rejoice because Jesus decided to do something for him on the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath was created for something. And now Jesus is here, who is the Son of Man. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. And I get the sense that it might have been created for this very lesson. God knew that the Pharisees were going to get their theology wrong. Part of the Sabbath was to isolate the Jewish population from the people around them. But I think part of it was also a preparation for this day to teach this lesson. This isn't about law. This isn't about regulation. This is about your position before me, how bad that is messed up, and how I'm going to restore that on your behalf. And we have to be careful. Jesus isn't saying, hey, it's okay to do things on the Sabbath as long as they're good. He's not refining the law. He's refining our understanding of where we are in relationship to God through the use of the law. And then how does he demonstrate his authority? He heals this guy. So that you might know that I am the Son of Man, I'm going to heal this guy. It's hard to argue with him at this point. Picking up in verse 12, in these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became the traitor. I actually love this passage because if you ever get asked, who were the 12 disciples? There it is, right there. You don't have to go put it all together. And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him, and he healed them all. Howard Marshall writes, they longed for healing and strove to touch Jesus in the belief that healing would come to them in the same way as when he stretched out his hand to touch the sick. Superstitious their belief may have been, but God accepted it, and his power went out from Jesus and healed them all. And I love the superstitious comment in there. We're in football season. And I don't know if you've seen those commercials for the NFL where these people are doing crazy things, that, wearing their one jersey that's the lucky jersey. And at the end of the commercial, it says, superstitious, question mark? Not if it works. Right? Not if it works. And I was a soldier, and I worked with soldiers long enough to know that they are equally superstitious. And yet they won't not be, because until they're dead, the fact that they're alive is proof that whatever their superstition is still working. And so I wonder here in this passage if those who were healed of their diseases or freed from the unclean spirits that troubled them would have called their actions superstitious. I don't think so. I think they would call it faithful obedience. They had heard something about Jesus and they believed it to be true enough that they went to him. Picking up in verse 20, and he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. For so their fathers did to the prophets. Can you see the blessing here? Where is the blessing in being poor? Where is the blessing in being hungry? Where is the blessing in the tears? It's there. Jesus looked at his disciples and pronounced a blessing on them. He's not blessing poverty in itself. That can easily be a curse. In fact, most people who find themselves in poverty work very hard to get out of poverty. If it was really a blessing, wouldn't you stay there? No. So we're talking about something else. And he's also not pronouncing a blessing on one social class above another. We're not talking about Marxism here. His disciples are poor, and they know that they are poor. They are poor in spirit. They are poor in righteousness. They are lacking the very thing that will save them from the judgment to come. They rely on God, and they must rely on him, for they have nothing of their own on which to rely. Of course, in Matthew, we read it explicitly. It says poor in spirit. And the contrast is true because the rich of the world are often self-reliant. And so the comparison still works. Do you rely on yourself for your own righteousness? To do so is to deceive yourself. What's that? It does sneak up on you. It does. But the reality is none of us are righteous. We are so poor in righteousness. And then the persecuted. Well, actually, let's talk. We're talking about the blessing here. The blessing in being poor, the blessing in being hungry, and the blessing in crying. And that hunger isn't just a hunger for food. It's a hunger for righteousness. Do you want to be righteous? The answer to that question will reveal how much you love your sin. There are some sins that we don't want to give up. It says, man loved his sins so much that he preferred darkness. Do you hunger for righteousness? And do you cry? Do you cry as you look at the world, brokenhearted for what it's become compared to what it was intended to be? And this is speaking right at the Pharisees. You guys got it wrong. You think that you are rich. You think that you are righteous. And of course you don't cry. In fact, you pray that not only did God make you a Jew, that he didn't make you a Jewish woman. You don't cry. You're sitting in a good spot. And so Jesus is again clarifying their theology. According to their theology, they were doing the things that they needed to be doing. And they were in a good spot. And then comes the persecution. Again, where's the blessing in it? Those who suffer in this way, though, are not to be pitied. They are blessed. Jesus tells them to rejoice and leap for joy. They have an eternal reward. And they are in a godly succession. The prophets were treated in the same way. I've got a grandfather. He's my grandfather-in-law, World War II veteran. A great man. Took great care of his family. Worked hard his whole life. Was not afraid to do the things that needed to be done. All I want at the end of my life is to be able to stand in his presence and say, hey, I did the best I could. And for him to say, oh, I know. And when we talk about persecution here, if you are persecuted, you are in good company. God's people can expect nothing else. If you are doing this Christian life right, you're going to be persecuted. Jesus doesn't warn us. He promises that this is what's going to happen. If you're absurdly happy, be careful. Now, don't get me wrong. There's joy that comes in the midst of all of this. But Jesus here is talking about a correct understanding, and that's the blessing. When you understand where you are, especially to these Pharisees, if they were to really understand why they were poor, what they should be hungering for, and why they should be crying, do you know what they wouldn't have missed? The presentation of their Messiah on the stage. And when you know those three things, then you know you need Jesus. There's the blessing, because in finding Jesus, you find eternal life and an inheritance that is bigger than anything in this world. But woe to you who are rich, for you received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did to the false prophets. And again, Jesus is speaking directly to the Pharisees here. Woe to you guys. You don't get it. You're laughing at those people who are less fortunate than you. You don't realize how rich, how poor you are. They're the exact opposite of the Beatitudes. And wealth predisposes people to think that they have need of nothing. And I'm not entirely sure that that's true. I think the super wealthy suspect that they are in need of something else. The super poor and the poor absolutely know. And I think who's the most at risk of deceiving themselves? The middle class. That could be interesting. I don't know what you do with that. Maybe that's another sermon for another day. But I think most of us in here are somewhere in that middle class. And so we're not immune to these things. In fact, we are probably more susceptible. But people who think that they have everything that they need or that they can solve all of their problems become unaware of the problems that they really have. It's interesting too. I know a good friend of mine. We grew up in the same neighborhood. In fact, I think I was friends with her brother because I had a crush on her. Her health is relatively good. She's married to a great man. Their son, close to graduating high school, is a good kid. Their jobs have provided a home, and they have never been hungry or wanted for anything. And yet I'm pretty sure they have no idea how spiritually empty their lives are. I know they don't go to church. I know they don't believe in anything. And then finally, there's this danger that all men will speak well of you. If everybody's speaking well of you, then you should be suspicious. You're about to be played. And don't get me wrong, it's important to be well thought of. But you can't sacrifice truth for that either. And it is the false prophets who win wide acclaim. A true prophet is too uncomfortable to be popular. And that's the thing I discovered about doing sermons. If I procrastinate and do my sermon at the last minute, it's very thin. And not because I haven't put time in it, but because the passage I'm exploring hasn't had enough time to process through my own life. What does this mean for me? And so the prophet is more often than not revealing things that are not popular. And so if you're a popular prophet, be careful. Picking up in verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. And we got to be careful, because Jesus did not come to establish a new law. He's clarifying. And he's really talking to the Pharisees and the scribes. So we're talking about worldview things here. And this stuff would have had a broad implication. It was understood in the Greco-Roman world as a whole, not just the Jewish world. Enemies were often defined in ethnic terms in the Old Testament. The Samaritans, the Romans.
So, where it says, so who takes away your goods do not.
Yeah, we'll get right to it. We're building into that because there's some things here that just kind of blew my mind. And we read in Leviticus, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Neighbor and enemies is very synonymous here, because when they were talking about neighbor, in fact, Jesus picked the Samaritan for that parable. The Samaritans were an ethnic enemy of the Jews. And so this has its roots in the Old Testament. This isn't something new. Jesus is just clarifying and refining their understanding of what it all means. And so in the Old Testament, the cloak is an inalienable possession. That's like as a police officer, I will almost let you take anything you want right up until you decide to take my firearm. But in the Old Testament work, the cloak was almost as important. In Exodus, we read, if ever you take your neighbor's cloak and pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Can you hear the love in this statement? The guy wants your cloak, give it to him. He needs it. It's pointing to the love that you should have for your fellow man. And there it is in the Old Testament. And what else is he gonna sleep? In the army, we have our whoopee. It's the lining that goes on your poncho, which is really just a tarp with a hole cut in it. But that thing is so warm. Nobody gives away their whoopee. Nobody takes another soldier's whoopee because what else is he going to sleep in? Who would do that to another soldier? And so when we're talking about that cloak, when we're talking about taking it or giving him another one, we're talking about the level of love that not only do you have for your friends and your family, but the level of love that you have for your enemies and your neighbors. And it's hard. It's hard because we live in a world of scarcity. What if it's my only coat? And that's ironic because we're sitting in a building that's packed with coats for a coat program. But Jesus says, consider the lilies of the field. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. Worry about whether or not you're loving your neighbor. Do you know God's going to get us another coat? Pretty confident of that. And so we're not establishing a law or taking the law to the next level. We're illustrating what the law is. It's a refinement of our understanding of what love is. And for me this week, as I've gone through this chapter, I'm discovering more and more that the God of the Old Testament is a God of love too. There it is. That's Exodus. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. And it's connected to their usury laws as well. When we read in Deuteronomy, when you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the men to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. So in the rabbinic tradition, in the Pharisaic, ultra-conservative, legalistic understanding, slapping a person and pulling off his coat are considered among the most serious acts of insult. The most serious acts of uncaring. And so the command to give here appears to be an extension of the Mosaic regulation against usury. You're not righteous because you are not charging usury. You're righteous if you love your neighbor. And if you love your neighbor, you won't charge him usury, especially his coat. And you won't slap him in front of his friends. And if he slaps you, don't slap him back. Why? Because you love him. And this is hard for me because if you slap me, I'm okay with that. I've been in enough fights and clubbed over the head. I can take a pretty good hit to figure out what it is that we're going to do to solve this problem. But if you threaten my family, I'm not going to give you a second to even think about it. And I don't believe God is saying, or that Jesus is saying here, that we don't have a right to defend ourselves. But what he's using are the two things that every Pharisee would have understood as the bare minimum for loving somebody. You love somebody so much you don't slap them because that's going to look bad for them. And you don't take their coat because what else are they going to sleep in? And so it's really talking about loving our enemies all the way down to that level. In Exodus again, we read, if you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. The guy's poor and he needs money, just give him money. In Leviticus, we read, take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. This isn't an opportunity to make economic gain. This is an opportunity to love your brother. And the rule applies to your neighbor, and the rule applies to your enemy. It's an opportunity, not for economic gain. In Deuteronomy, we read, "You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it." And it goes back to the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery is one of my favorite. Husbands, if you truly love your wives, would you commit adultery? Do you know what damage that causes to a wife? And wives, the same thing. Do you know if it was true that if we were loving our spouses righteously, I don't think you would even have to put that in the 10 Commandments. You would just do it. And so here we have the Pharisees who think that by following all these rules they can get into heaven. And really, it's just demonstrating that they have no love for their neighbor. They're only concerned about themselves. Does not lend at interest or take any profit, withholds his hand from justice, executes true justice between man and a woman, or between man and man. I think I found all of them in there because it just blew my mind. This isn't about what's the right thing to do. This is about whether or not you love your neighbor. And Jesus is applying that to your enemies. You shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it might be. And it's understood to be alone. It absolutely is. Because when you give your brother-in-law money, your brother-in-law feels like a deadbeat. And when your brother-in-law pays you back, he feels again like a man. So we should give everybody that opportunity too. I think that falls in the category of not slapping him. The wicked borrows but does not pay back, but the righteous is generous and gives. He is ever lending generously, and his children become a blessing. Psalm 37:21. And the next one is also in Psalm 37. It's 26. He is ever lending generously, and his children become a blessing. And then in Proverbs we read, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. And so we are absolutely not to bring our neighbors, our enemies, into slavery in what should be an act of generosity. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. I think that just expands on what we were just talking about. And the command at the end of it is to imitate the mercy of God. And it's not just a call to be merciful. It's a call to be a faithful partner in what it is that God is doing. We, as God's people, as sons of the Most High, are to be about our Father's business, and whatever that looks like in your life. I just loaned a buddy of mine $400. You guys all know I'm out of work. Guess who doesn't know I've loaned my buddy $400? My wife. And I absolutely know that it's going to be a long time before my wife can pay me back. And I've reminded my buddy twice that he owes me $400. As firmly as I can, but as gently as I can. I can stand to lose the $400 if he never pays me back. But oh my gosh, am I going to play it up on the day that he pays me the $400 back? Because you know what he needs more than anything? To feel like he can pay back his $400. Picking up in verse 37, judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. I think this is one of the most misunderstood passages in the Bible. All the world knows of Jesus' exhortation to judge not, but I think very few know what this really means. The Greek word for condemnation is let me see if I can get this right, katadikazo. And it means to pronounce guilty and to condemn. And it comes from kata, which is frequently denotes opposition, distribution, or it's an intense opposition. It's what you would feel towards your enemy. And often it can include the act of judgment or punishment or vengeance. It's the idea of judge, jury, and executioner in that condemnation. So we're not to condemn at that level. How can you love your enemy if you have pronounced a judgment on them in which you are now in intense opposition to them? The reality is, and that's what Jesus is really getting at with this conversation with the Pharisees, is he wants them to understand the reality. And the reality is that apart from God's grace, we are all condemned. When we properly recognize that we are all poor in spirit, that we should all hunger for righteousness, that we should all be weeping, then we begin to properly understand that we are all in need of salvation. And how can you, who cannot escape your own condemnation, pronounce condemnation on another? The grace of God is that he pronounced that condemnation onto Jesus. Our job then is not to condemn, but to extend grace, to give grace, because we love. And the more of that we give, the more of that we will receive. Now, how do you do that? That's the hard part. What does that look like? Because there's a difference in my mind between condemnation and trying to make a right decision. Because if you now understand that you are in fact spiritually poor, that you should be hungering for righteousness that you don't have, and that you should be weeping because you cannot get it, what do you do now? And that decision needs to be informed rightly. And so you have to judge your situation correctly. And I would really appreciate it if you would help me judge my situation, which is hard. Because if you come at me with something that I'm doing wrong, usually my response is going to be back off first. I'm going to get mad and try to convince you to not ask me about that again, because it's probably embarrassing. And who are you anyway? And so we have to do that for the people that we care about. And it shouldn't surprise us that that's their reaction. And one of my favorite illustrations is there I was on a Sunday morning as a police officer. And Sundays were the days that you're supposed to be able to catch up on your paperwork. And so it was probably 11 o'clock. Church was about to it was right in that gray area where some churches were going to church and some churches were coming out of church. When a 911 call came in, there was a lady with two small children, and there was somebody aggressively knocking at her door and screaming at her to let him in. And so I ran over there with my lights and sirens, and sure enough, there was a drunk at the door, big guy. And so, in fact, I probably gave up law enforcement mostly because I just don't like dealing with drunks. He was belligerent, he was angry. And all I needed to do was get him off the front step and figure out how to get him moving towards the door that was his. He very clearly thought this one was his. And so I was just kind of walking him the 25 yards to the sidewalk from the door. And the whole time I was walking him there, he was very clearly embarrassed that the police had been called. And he was saying, "You can't judge me. You can't judge me. Don't judge me." And so we finally get to the sidewalk. And I said, "Do you go to church?" And he says, "Well, yeah." I said, "Me too." And you are absolutely right. It's not my job to condemn you to hell. I think there's a day coming when we will face that condemnation, but I'm not here to do that. But it is my job to judge rightly, in that this is not your house. And you probably ought to move down the road to whichever one is yours. Jesus is illustrating to the Pharisees in this chapter what a right understanding of their predicament is. And once you have that right understanding of that predicament, you do have to make some decisions, and those decisions should be informed on reality. And if the reality is you're a sinner or you are sinning, we really need to get to a place where we recognize that somebody who's telling us that is they're not judging us to hell. They're trying to help us to make decisions with the best information that we can, because a day when we will be judged is coming.
I think what you said about judging, that people have the idea of the scripture incorrect, is that very thing. We aren't to judge people, but we do have to make judgment calls, and that's based on the right information.
Yeah, Jesus will say later on, judge rightly. Just do it rightly. And the thing that the Pharisees actually believed that the best thing that could happen to a Samaritan is that they die. Right? And so from their weird perspective of reality, condemning them to death is the loving thing to do. And Jesus is dealing with all of that. He's speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees about their understanding of reality. And he's not adding to the law. In fact, he's using the law to get them to understand the reality of where they are. So he's telling them, you're not to judge to condemnation, but you need to be informed rightly so that you can avoid the judgment that is coming. There's huge difference. One very much is love, and the other one is, I don't even know what to call it. So picking up in verse 39. He also told them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own? How can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye," when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. You know, truth and reality get a vote. The reality of your own lack of righteousness before God has to be seen and understood. And that's what Jesus is wrestling with the Pharisees. They don't get it. And to miss this is to fall into a pit. Jesus here is speaking to the Pharisees who considered themselves righteous on their own accord. They missed that they were equally poor, that they should also be weeping, and that they were also in need of salvation. This is the log in their eye. From this position, they were pronouncing condemnation on others, and Jesus was trying to get them to remove this log. He wasn't saying don't help your fellow person, but he was saying make sure that you know what you're talking about. For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from bramble bushes. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. And this is Jesus telling them that, hey, you guys, not only don't you get it, but everybody knows. You are hypocrites, and everybody knows. The evidence of the Pharisees' righteousness was known throughout the land. The good person is going to offer you the fruit of truth, fruit that will lead to repentance and salvation. That's why, you guys, I don't care what my response is. When you see me sinning, come and tell me. If I hurt your feelings, please come and tell me again. Eventually I get there. I do. But I want you to know I need your help, and I want you to care enough for me to help me.
And that's part of what we, as a body, are to do for
Yeah.
one another. We are to help one another be accountable
Yeah.
for those things.
And that's good fruit. But the evil person will offer you the fruit of hypocrisy. And we find Jesus spells it out in Matthew chapter 23, verses 3. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. And so I think you could even make the argument that they knew that their righteousness was not sufficient to get them into the kingdom of heaven, but it was sufficient to keep the people fooled who provided them the power that they needed. But the people knew. The people knew. Picking up in verse 46, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been built well. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. This sermon, like that in Matthew, concludes with an impressive reminder of the importance of acting on the teaching of Jesus. That's where good judgment comes in. Jesus is telling the Pharisees, you've got it wrong, and we need to tweak that understanding of reality. You are poor. You are hungry. Now I can't remember the third one. You should be weeping. Evidently, some had already shown themselves to be false disciples. I don't think that surprised Jesus. I went to try to find where he's first referred to as Lord by the Pharisees to see what's going on here when Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord? But what I discovered is everybody that is coming to Jesus is calling him Lord. And so Jesus is now saying, if you call me Lord, then you need to do what it is that I'm saying. You need to act on what it is that I'm telling you. And early on, we heard that Jesus preached the same message that John the Baptist preached. Repent. You've got to do something with what it is that Jesus is telling you. Repent. Let's pray.